I'm SJ Turp, and I'm speaking today about what the CogSec CoLab has learned running the CTI-League's disinformation team. So last year we came to disclosure and we talked about theory. So this year we're talking about practice. So 2020 really wasn't your grandmother's disinformation ecosystem. 2020 is where cognitive security, this idea of treating disinformation like information security, like InfoSec, it really caught on. So well done for catching up. So what are we talking about? So first, definitions. Disinformation. So that's what we're talking about. That's what we track. The idea here is it's not misinformation. Misinformation is where the content is false. In disinformation, the content doesn't have to be false. What's really interesting to us is attempts at large-scale belief change or large-scale emotion change. So looking at what we actually saw, we did see misinformation. CTI-League has concentrated on COVID-19 related misinformation. So these are the top level themes for some of the hundreds of narratives we've seen. So narratives, stories, these are useful because you see enormous number of messages. There are a lot fewer narratives. So they're a lot easier to track at this level. So especially if you're using things like text-based machine learning techniques, you can cluster, you can find the narratives within these. So we saw a lot from origin narratives, it doesn't exist, or it came from country X, which mutated into COVID isn't serious. We're still seeing those. All sorts of medical scams, all sorts of cures, all sorts of somebody has a cures. But we're also seeing a lot of crossover narratives. So we're seeing existing groups like anti-vaxxers, so people who originally were against vaccination in children, and hardcore right-wingers. And they're meeting up, they're joining forces. We're seeing conspiracy theories, things like the black helicopter theories and 5G theories being recycled. We're seeing them combined with 5G, with COVID and 5G, actually all of the above, into new narratives. And much of this was worth money. So there are reasons behind a lot of this. So intent. If you want to understand disinformation, you need to understand the motivations behind it. So here are some of the places it's typically coming from. Again, we talked about this last year, not real surprises here. Although there's been a lot of talk in 2020 about politically motivated disinformation, most of the things that we looked at, a lot of it was financially motivated. We kept digging, we kept finding money behind things. So having a look at those motivations. So instance that we tracked over in the CTI-League, a lot of them, we found someone trying to make money behind them, and it ranged. So we found a lot of t-shirts, Etsy shops selling t-shirts, Amazon selling t-shirts, related items, a lot of generated shops. We saw a lot of sophisticated sales, operations like cures, blood, networks of websites. So these have been around for a long time. So the use of ad tech, the use of paid clicks, the use of paid advertising space. So networks of websites generally selling advertising space. We tracked one instant back to someone selling their book about 5G. So, it's possible democracy will die because people are selling t-shirts and books, but, maybe not. But we kept on finding people trying to make money. So they're either originating narratives to make money, they were attaching themselves onto existing incidents, working out how to make money from that, or they were making money as disinformation providers. So one thing we could track, following the money is just as valid here as it is for organized crime. So you look at things like payment mechanisms. So who are the people, what are the payment mechanisms, how can it be cashed out? So track that, find that, see if there's an interruption there. So one thing that money does usually need is a URL, a point on the internet to point at. So if you're making money online, you'll need one of these. It's the Etsy shop, the Amazon shop. It's your own domains where you can control your sales on, that you can sell advertising space on, you can collect user details because you can sell user details too. So if you're tracking disinformation, these become important. They become important because they help you find more disinformation. We get an entry point into a network. Usually you get more than one. So You can map out networks of domains, you can map out associated social media, you can map out linked disinformation campaigns. And we've done quite well. Looking at legislations, we've done quite well looking with tools like BuiltWith, finding sites using things like Google Analytics, finding sites using things like the advertising tax. So wherever money, again, where they're spending money, there's ways to look through there. Natural News is an interesting site. It's a well-known healthcare misinformation site, but it's broadened out. Again, 2020, there seem to be all of these crossovers. So for example, this year we found it amplifying the story about anti-fire on buses coming to your rural communities. So these are kind of useful sites too, because they give us a sense of the zeitgeist of disinformation. And let's have a look at some of the things that we tracked. So here's one. We looked at We Won't Stay Home. So this was interesting to us because the anti-lockdown campaigns, the anti-stay-at-home campaigns were part of the wider COVID health incidents. A lot of people going out on the street, not wearing masks, a lot of people coming together was initially part of health. So this was a small incident, but like many others, it seeded a much larger incident, Operation Gridlock, that happened later. Another thing that we saw happening, starting to happen especially in the US, was that this spread across states. It also spread across countries. So this was an early use of astroturfing here in 2022. We saw groups creating and populating a group per state. We started looking, when we saw a new campaign, for those extra groups, other groups starting up per state. So this is kind of part of our background. Another evolution, when we created Amit, we talked about that last year as well. I know there's a lot of, we talked about this last year, but we've been doing this for a while. So when we created Amit, which is our model of what the bad guys are doing, so you know how to interrupt them, we included going physical as one of the categories. Because even though at the time it was a fairly rare move, we thought it might become a lot more important. And surprise, surprise, 2020, going physical became a lot more important. So we've seen a lot more physical moves. We've seen a lot more people going out on the streets. We've seen a lot more groups of opposing groups being collected at the same place. And we've seen a lot more things like these face mask exemption cards. So these are printed out physical cards people can carry, try to get past the regulations, requests in shops for people to wear face masks. So we've seen a lot of this coming out of homespun ideas. So the card on the left is a long spiel, it's hipper, it's misspelled. It's a little bit of a mess, but it got picked up, it got cleaned up, it got productionized. And we're seeing this either for money. So for example, the Freedom to Breathe Agency is taking PayPal donations and it's collecting user details, or it's supporting other campaigns like the anti-mask campaigns, or both. And we're also seeing this cross, again, countries and communities. So the card on the right is from Canada, and it lists organizations that target parents. So it's a different demographic, a different country. The response in Canada was cut this up with scissors. It was a different type of response, which gets us into another thing that happened in 2020. And this was good to see. So in 2019, one of the pieces of work that we did towards the end of the year was worked on countermeasures to disinformation. So we'll talk about this towards the end of here, but we looked at ways that you could start countering specific tactics, specific techniques. And it was good to see that this was starting to happen, has been starting to happen. So it's been a breakout year. So K-pop fans flooding extremist hashtags with boy band images. Social media companies are taking down content that's just isn't just immediate threats to life. So it's good to see all of this counter activity. It's not just people sitting admiring the problem anymore, as Pablo would put it. So it's also been a great year for homegrown countermeasures, like the mask exemption override cards. Because when you show geeks a bunch of cards in real life, the first thing they're going to do is to find a counter card. So they built them. And the other thing about disinformation is it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Disinformation is part of an information space. So if you just remove the disinformation from the space, you leave a vacuum behind it. In fact, one of the reasons disinformation is successful is quite often it's going into information vacuums. People are searching and they're finding disinformation in the places they're looking. So if you take out the disinformation, you need to have information or routes to information in ways that people can consume it in the places they want to consume it in. And again, we've seen the social media companies do a pretty good job on making that information accessible and available. So there are also, again, some very good information teams have been growing up, especially around COVID. And we've been involved with one of them. The reality team has been producing these nice little counter cards. They've been working out how to rapidly respond. So how do you do rapid counter narratives whilst the narratives are evolving? So counter narratives data in real time. And other evolutions. So disinformation is starting to get the attention of organized crime. There's a United Nations report out on that soon, but not really seeing the economics on that yet. So at the moment, I think ransomware is a better business model if you're making large amounts of money. But mostly businesses, principals, you're seeing them caught up in disinformation campaigns rather than being the end targets. The business of disinformation. So we're seeing developing world spam companies, marketing companies pivoting to provide disinformation as a service. So Recorded Future did a good report on this, and we've seen the use of a fake NGO, so a fake aid agency in Ghana that's been targeting African Americans. That was an interesting piece of work. Deep fake tech. So if you want to look at this as a business, you're going to need to scale. So deepfake tech is still a little too complicated, a little too expensive to massively scale, but it's coming. So there's already text. GPT-3 is pretty good. And the next evolutions, you're looking at video voice, already used in a couple of targeted attacks. They're up here on the board. And really, in terms of bad guy evolution, we think the likely transition is from small specialized agencies, so those pivoted agencies as pivoted marketing agencies, because disinformation really, it's dark marketing. It's boutique. You know, at the moment, it's pretty much boutique capability. It's boutique or it's organic. But going from that to market expansions, so disinformation becoming a commodity capability. Really, I keep comparing it against ransomware. I periodically check against ransomware because I think the market will take off when it becomes viable against ransomware or part of. So one way to think about that is to model and analyze. So the two sides, there are many sides, but the two sides we look at, the blue team side. So as CTI-League responders, we do a lot of response. You need to have response plans. One thing we're releasing is our response plans. Playbooks are useful as guides, not necessarily canon, but at least to give you senses of ways you could do things. And tracking. You will be tracking campaigns, instance, narratives, artifacts. I'll go through those in a minute. Again, we've spoken about this before. Red teaming. So CogSec Collab, every week we run a red team meeting. It's known as the Fuckery Factory. Please don't, Mum, if you're watching, I'm sorry. But that's what it is. And yes, I will get the tattoo. But here are some of the topics we've covered on that. And they've been extremely useful. If you put yourself into the other guy's shoes, if you red team this, you learn a lot. And we've learned an awful lot. We've changed our practices because we get insights every time we do this. We go, oh yeah, of course, that's why. And a lot of this is about resourcing. If you think about each other's resources, then it makes a lot more sense. So thinking about 2020, thinking about what this thing is, thinking about it as an InfoSec person. So cognitive security, it's real. I think this year you can actually say we've stopped just talking about it. We've stopped just admiring it. It's a real thing. It's now part of your toolkit. So it's a rapidly growing domain. It interacts with cybersecurity, physical security is the third thing. And it includes information operations. It includes disinformation. It isn't just those things. So it's this idea of brains as endpoints, human communities as parts of the network, human beings as parts of the network. So it's much more than social engineering scale. So 1,000 bullet problems, 1,000 bullet solutions. As Pablo says, it's not a silver bullet problem. It's a 1,000 bullet problem. So to deal with this, to solve this, you're talking a collaborative, heterogeneous, connected problem, and you need a similar solution. So we need to build an ecosystem. And it's not just a bunch of big players. We need lots of different groups at lots of different scales that are working together. We need to connect them in a way that respects those groups, that respects the subjects of disinformation, but also respects the accounts from the groups that are being investigated. And that respect is important, always important. Also, you have to respect the guys who are creating, and that's, you know, just because they're doing it doesn't mean you can't respect what they do. But practically, that means you have to think about privacy. That means you have to think about sharing mechanisms, and that means you have to think about standards. So let's go think about some of those axes. So disinformation layers. So again, you've seen this model before. So this is the idea that as one of the bad guys, you have these longer term campaigns. So anti-vax, 5G, longer term subjects, longer term campaigns. Destabilizing national politics is a long-term thing. It's going to take you months, years. But inside that, you get these shorter duration incidents. So these are bursts of activities, usually around a specific topic or a specific event. And the units those are based on are narratives. So these are the stories we tell ourselves. So they're identity stories, which are the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. They're the in-group and out-group stories that we tell ourselves about who we do and don't belong to. And they're the stories about the world. So what's happening around us. And what they show up on, or show up as, in our communications with other humans and online, are artifacts. So these are the messages, these are the images, these are the user accounts, these are the groups, and these are relationships between all of those. And as a data scientist, I see all the artifacts. I have to work out from that, the narratives, the instants, the campaigns. If I'm lucky, I get intelligence information. If I'm not, I've got to work up from the bottom. As somebody generating, I see from the top. It's always going to be the way. Another axis, the type of tasks you're doing. So this is threat intelligence. And we deliberately embedded inside a threat intelligence team. And we're learning a lot from each other. They're learning a lot about disinformation and how that works. We're learning a lot more about threat intelligence and how that works. So we're finding current and future threats. We want to find, predict, and neutralize the current and the future threats. And inside that rests on intelligence skills, which are basically assessing the situation picture. And in this case, you're usually working on OSINT. Most of the time you don't have full access to data, so mostly you're working on open source data. So it's finding that situation picture, but you're using publicly available data. And to do that rests a lot on data science, which is finding the patterns in big data that's arriving quickly across many channels. That's the 3 V's. That's volume, velocity, and variety. 4th V is veracity, and we kind of got that one covered. This is where I talk about attribution. So attribution is working out who's responsible for a disinformation incident. Usually you attribute to a country or a group, and this is hard. You don't have full access to data. And there are incentives for the people who are generating disinformation to obfuscate, to hide who they are. So really, if you're doing tactical disinformation, attribution, it's probabilistic. You might get a hint at who might be behind this, sometimes from what they're interested in, sometimes from how they're operating. But even that hint can help us assess potential moves and potential counter moves. And that's what we're interested in. Not who it is, but what is happening. Which situation are we in? What is likely to happen next? What can we do? So another axis, time. This is a data science ladder. Data scientists are kind of used to looking at this. On the left is basically, I've got some data, what happened? All the way to the right, which is, I've got some data, I'm in an environment, what's happening around me? If I change this environment, what's going to happen again? So it goes from very old static stuff to totally interactive. But this also applies to disinformation. So your work is ranging from assessing what's happened in the past to predicting what might happen next, to moving up to moves and counter moves in an interactive environment. And we're seeing that shift. We're seeing that shift this year in disinformation. I think we're probably around prescriptive at the moment, heading towards cognitive self-learning, and gets us to the last axis. So this is the response timescales. And again, this is shifting again. So we're seeing these different timescales. We've seen a lot of strategic disinformation response. So this idea that you'd spend a long time, small number of people analyzing very, very carefully. And you get the other end is tactical. You're trying to respond in the timescale that the people generating disinformation are working in. I'm going to talk about OODA loops. I'm sorry, but I will. And a lot of this is about getting inside each other's operating loops. In between, you've got operational, there's work in the middle where you're working within timescales, but they're slightly longer timescales. But CTI disinfo, we're tactical. We're trying to respond to disinformation as it happens and trying to respond to make a difference as it happens. Other teams do different things. You know, if you have just a few hours to respond, maybe a couple of days, all you care about is stopping that flood. If you have months, you get into attribution, you get into geopolitics, you get into motives, because you have more things you can do with those timescales. Interestingly, this year, again, many of the strategic groups, many of the people who have done this longer timescale things are becoming more tactical. So, instant response. How does this work? So let's look at how we set these up. So, this isn't a new problem. We've addressed it before. So 10 years ago, we did this as crisis mappers. So as a crisis mapper, I set up procedures for data analysis, for sharing in reaction to sudden onset disasters. So set up connected groups doing this around the world. So this very, very similar problem, similar solution. So this maps onto disinformation too. So tracking COVID-19 instance through the CTI-League's disinformation team. So CTI-League, global volunteer, emergency response community, very much focus on InfoSec. We're embedded in as part of that. That there's us, classic InfoSec, Darknet, work closely together. And here's the disinformation equivalents of the main services that the League works on. So we have equivalences here, but we're focusing today, we're talking today about just the instant response part. So if you want to do instant response, and we'd really like a lot of people to be doing this, you need the usual process triangle: people, process, technology, and culture. Yeah, no, it's a square, whatever. So the TLDR of this is you need enough trained people, and they need to respond fast enough to be able to make a difference to an incident. And that includes things like noticing incidents fast enough to respond. And it includes having things like connections to make those differences happen, or ways to make those differences happen. And there's a lot of things in between. We're going to move on and look at those things in between. One thing that we've been doing is setting up the processes, tools, training, because running a large group doesn't work without them. So we've been working on those, CogSec CoLab, CTI-League Disinfo together. And we've been working on how to share those out to other groups. So we've started with the adaptations we've made to threat intelligence tools. we've heavily adapted MISP. So we've already shared that with NATO, we've shared that with the EU, we've shared that with other countries. We're putting out our process manual, so we've cleaned that up. We're starting to share that with other groups. We're open sourcing that. And after we've done that, we're going to start sharing our training courses. So as we learn, we want to share this. We want this to become those lots of different groups, lots of different points. Again, with the ethics, again, with the, it has to be always with those thoughts of how do you do this ethically? How do you do this with those different respects? So back to basics, looking at those loops. So a bit of my own personal history. So almost 4 years ago, I started talking about the overlaps between disinformation, information security, machine learning, and military competition, short of armed conflict. And this is one of the diagrams I use. This is Boyd's original OODA loop diagram, the one that actually has the interesting stuff in. Boyd's work, like Sun Tzu's work, it's been abused for everything from childcare to management theory. But you know, originally it was about understanding why some pilots were better at winning dogfights. And a lot of this was about getting inside each other's loops. So let's look at our own dogfights. So let's start with observation, seeing something. And CTI, it gets its feeds in from other groups that are observing. It gets feeds in from its own monitoring. It gets feeds in from its own members. But most alerts start with an artifact. We find an image, we get a URL, we get a piece of text. And there's something, you know, either it's starting to go viral, there's something about it that needs further look. So the first thing we have to do is decide whether to treat this as an incident. And there are things that we can look at. We look at harms frameworks. So is this potentially doing harm? So we look at the types of harm, we look at the sizing on it. Is it big? What are the potential effects? Is this disinformation? Because not everything that's false is disinformation. Not everything that's disinformation is relevant. And we also look at whether we're the best team to respond to this, because we track things that we have a reasonable chance of doing something about. We don't just track things for fun. We pass on things that we can't. So when we're assessing, we look at the other information we have. So we see things like, you know, repeat offenders. We look for things like known medical scams. So are we the right group? And one of the questions, again, with these lots of different groups responding, is knowing who else is out there, is keeping an eye on everybody else. And if we see the platforms out there, if we see other people doing takedowns, great. There are always other things to do. But again, there has to be that joined up. So this is something else we're going to talk about, is how you start that collaboration, how you start those flash alerts. So let's have a look at some of the tasking once we get started. But just seeding that idea that before you do the long, pretty alerts, you do need to do those sudden flash alerts of, I've seen something, but you need to do it with respect in channels that aren't going to create panic. Okay, tactical tasks. So once we've started an incident, our first job here is to gather enough information to determine whether we should act, whether we should hand it over, whether we should hand the information over to another party, whether we should stand down, whether we should not act, but just keep a watch on this area. Sometimes we see something and it might be disinformation, but it's not that active. Or it's something that might turn into something. We'll just keep an eye on it for a bit. Quite often it'll go away. And this is usually a mixture of activity analysis on artifacts, network analysis, some fact checking. And this is the tactical work. We also do monitoring work behind this, looking at spreader analysis. So looking for infrastructure and accounts that are set up in advance of incidents and looking for things like sock puppets. So laundering, maturity. And a lot of this is old school odds int. There's still a lot by hand, but again, with the 3 Vs. These things are coming fast. They're coming at volume. They're coming across a lot of channels. So we need help. We can't do that fast enough with just humans. So we have to speed up with machines. Here are some of the places that can be done. So we're already using graph analysis. So the image is a Gephi graph from one of our incidents. We're already using some image analysis. So we've clustered text from the EU disinfo into narratives. And we've been experimenting with ways to cluster images so it can minimize the number of times we expose humans to sometimes difficult information. That's another thing. It's not just about speed. It's also about exposure. A lot of this material, even if you're expecting it, even if you're used to it, can be difficult to keep reading, to keep watching. If there are ways to cut down the amount of exposure your team has to material, then you should take that. Anything that helps. Part of our big book, our process manual is safety. And that's part of the safety process. So also, as part of the machine learning AI, we're doing a trial run of a data science for disinformation response course. So we're just trying this stuff out. There are some other good teams out there working on this, High Project Domino. So just keep an eye. I think this one will grow. So having pulled in the data, let's look at Orient, the sense making, understanding what you observed in context. So sense making, it includes looking at what we've collected to work out what's happening and what might happen across the whole incident. So one way to do that is analyzing connections between incident objects. So we use MISP for that. It's an open source threat intelligence platform. We've repurposed it. It was built for malware. We've repurposed it to disinformation. And we've built a disinformation community that includes NATO, EU countries around it. It's built on Sticks, which is the sharing standard used by ISACs and ISALs. So we've extended that slightly for disinformation. Again, last year we talked about adding instant narrative to this. And we use Amit for the attack patterns part of this. We use this in the wild, it works. Amit, we've talked about the Amit framework before. It's how we break an incident down into techniques. If you have the techniques, you can analyze them, you can counter them. So it's now embedded in MISP. We've handed it over to MITRE to manage. They're extending it out. We've seen extensions for finance. We've got our own technique extensions. So during observation, we'll go through and we'll tick the Amit boxes. During Orient, we look at this diagram. We work out what's happening from this. And we think about how we might respond. If we catch an incident early, we get a half-filled Amit, which is great because we can think about what downstream techniques we might get. This example, this is Plandemic. It's a conspiracy theory video. It's debunked COVID-19. So we mapped it onto Amit. We were thinking about the capabilities the actor had, thinking about how they were resourced, thinking about how we might counter. So other objects. So what we get out of Orient is an incident report. And that report contains a summary. It contains narratives, techniques, artifacts, objects. We also get that MISP event. And you can share that MISP event directly with other groups, or you can send out emails from MISP. So you can share that direct, emails, threat intelligence tools. There are a bunch of ways. So we've added a few things to MISP for that. One of the things that was missing were the object types for common social media platforms. We've added those in. Those are now part of MISP. We've also added in some new relationship types just to make the graphs that you can traverse in MISP to understand what's going on a bit richer. And taxonomies. There are some existing threat taxonomies like the DFR lab dichotomies. We've added those into MISP, but we're also working on a tactical version. Gives us things like threat actor types. So we're working on that just to extend out the tactical work. Okay, so we've now oriented. Now we're heading to decide. I said I'd go through the OODA loop. So what are our options? Should we act? Do we want to act? What are the ways that we could affect a disinformation incident? What are the ways that people connected to us could affect one? So who? Again, been here before. So potential responders are the whole of a society. So that society includes the InfoSec bodies that are already linked by the ISALs, by the cyber interpols. But you've also got the platforms, law enforcement, government, ELVs being these groups like the COGSET Lab, the CTI-League, and building those together, working out how you do full society responses. And the other thing that we worked on last year was responses and mitigations. So this is the what's. So MISINFOSEC, which is the group that COGSET Collab grew out of, we worked on mitigations, we worked on countermeasures. So we built this course of action matrix from the AMIT tactic stages and the JP3, the list of effects, the TLDR for the 7 Ds there, prevent the access, break the bad guys' flow, add friction to their processes, honeypot them, damage their operations, and remove the incentives to create disinformation in the first place. So look at those, look at the stages, work out ways to do that per technique. And we've built out theory and examples for effects-based. So the CTI-League is only using effects-based at the moment. So we report to law enforcement, report to platforms, report to registrars. The COGSET Collab is helping set up the reality team to work on counter narratives and connect that back to the CTI-League. We've also worked on tactic-based, which is this AMIT tactic versus effects. And we've looked at doctrine-based. So this is the idea of resource exhaustion on both sides. So that gets us to act. So having looked at those options of who can act, how they can work together, it's time to act, which is the point at which you're making a change in environment. And this is the point at the top of that data science ladder that we haven't quite reached. So this is the point where you potentially start interacting with your environments. So again, this isn't a static environment. There are other human beings in there. Again, with the respect for the guys on the other side. Again, with the red teaming and understanding. So when you act in a disinformation space, you're acting in an environment. There's a lot of other humans, there are other machines in there. And what you end up in is a multiplayer game. You're each acting in response to each other. You're playing off against each other's resources. So Grug, Pablo, myself, we've been working on this, but that's for another talk. So thank you. That was a quick spin around CTI Disinfo and COGSET Collab in 2020. And you can learn more about us at ctileague.com and cogsetcollab.org. Bye.